This was therefore, and could be no other, like a sword thrust in water, serving only to render relations with the admiral more strained. But at this time, the controversy was not altogether continuous, and a lull occurred during which Masson frequently visited Plantation House. All the French party, including even Les Cazes, was present on the 20th at a ball given by the admiral and stayed to supper. If there was a respite in the quarrels with the English, those between themselves persisted. From the time they were aboard the Northumberland, Les Cazes and Gourgaud were at daggers drawn, the latter accusing the former of having disclosed certain indiscreet statements to the emperor. The emperor had given Gourgaud a piece of his mind, and the latter never forgave Les Cazes. This feud was aggravated by a preference shown by Napoleon for Les Cazes, his having him at the Briars and making him his confidant and private secretary. Masson considered that he had charge of the household affairs and complained, and Bertrand showed unusual opposition towards the emperor. Gourgaud, whose sensitiveness was ceaselessly awakened, set an eagle eye on one and all and made himself heard if he thought that someone was being treated better than he. The two ladies quarreled and called each other names, Madame Bertrand accusing Masson of being a spy. And this was the state of affairs a month after landing. Idleness was without doubt responsible as much as jealousy, so the emperor, possibly at the suggestion of Les Cazes, could see storms ahead of him, and who wanted peace contrived to employ all his companions at the same time upon his work and to attack the Italian and Egyptian campaigns, the consulate, and the return from Elba simultaneously. It must be admitted, as Les Cazes had hoped, that by such an arrangement the hours seemed shorter, that this wonderful work made rapid strides, and that those employed were less miserable. Starting on October 22nd, Gourgaud was engaged upon a narration of the siege of Toulon, of the fortification of the coasts of the 18th of Brumaire, and the birth of the consulate. Masson a little later that of 13 Vendemiaire, and Bertrand that of Egypt, as there were several books including the Annual Register, which he had to translate. Gourgaud was kept busy after taking down the dictation and reading the fair copy of the preceding one. These gentlemen stayed to dinner. The cook was actually in residence at the Briars. Linen and plate were brought out, and the meal became a welcome interlude. But afterwards, the visitors returned to the town, and with some difficulty, the time was passed until 11 o'clock, when the emperor retired to bed. An unsuccessful attempt was made at walking. Often he would remain seated at the table under the tent to chat with Les Cazes, but more often he would sit down in a glade where the Balcombes joined him with their mother and told him the news, the rumors prevalent in the village or the camp, the gossip which the ships in port had brought from England or the Cape, foolish, idiotic stories scarcely worth repeating, but which momentarily aroused curiosity or hope. In Paris or Vienna or Berlin, Napoleon had always delighted in hearing his wife, his mistress, or at a pinch his valet recount stories to him in this way, even about people whom he did not know and whom in all probability he would never have any chance of meeting. I would not go so far as to say that he did not enjoy happy hours during this evening when the coolness of the day had a refreshing effect on him. He used to sit in a favorite glade where his coffee was brought to him, and where he would stroll about for a long while chatting. He would gaze into the cloudless sky among new constellations, as if looking for his star. He returned to happy times, talked to Josephine and Marie Louise, and became affected at the thought of his son. Perhaps one day, he said, this lane will bring pleasant recollections. Up till the end of November, his health had been perfect, but about the middle of the month, he caught a feverish cold, and on the 23rd he was very unwell, kept at his room, and refused to see anyone. This cold, of which he had a slight recurrence at the beginning of December, was not at all serious, and never once was there any concern regarding his general health. It was idleness rather than the chill which became intolerable to him. The tete-a-tete with Les Cazes lasted 6 weeks, and formerly he settled a man in less than an hour. He at least desired to vary his interlocutors, and sent for Gorgo from the town, whom he put in the tent. Gorgo was certainly industrious and intelligent, but an artful dodger. He had the wars and the campaigns at his finger ends, for he had followed the emperor since 1812. He wrote quickly, composed well, knew the numberless anecdotes about the people of the court which could provide amusement, but he was by nature a contradictor, easily offended, suspicious, inquisitive. He inflamed the emperor against the admiral upon very conceivable opportunity, and against Colonel Bingham, who nevertheless increased his acts of goodwill and doubled his readiness to oblige, on the pretext that at the first ball the admiral had not shown the Frenchmen, and especially Gorgo, the deference due to them. The emperor decided to forbid all his companions to go to a ball given by Governor Wilkes, and Madame Bertrand and Madame de Masson put back into their trunks the dresses they had intended to wear. Furthermore, at the Briars, Gorgo now grew tired of relating how the admiral, the colonel, the governor, or some other officer or other had been disrespectful to him, and therefore had been disrespectful to the emperor. Masson, arriving from the town, retailed some wonderful news upon which his imagination had been working in order to please his master. France was in revolt. An army of 150,000 men had been mobilized, and the whole populace were demanding the emperor. England was terrified, arming her forces, and they went on this assumption without suspecting that there was no longer a French army, and that the 150,000 foreigners filled with all the military positions. As for the Grand Marshal, who was often rebuked because he disliked being the bearer of fruitless complaints, he sulked a little in a dignified manner. It was opportune for the colony that a distraction intervened to bring it out of this futility, and that for a time at least it was sufficiently occupied to ward off these ill humors. On December 8th, the admiral came to announce that the building was finished at Longwood, and asked the emperor what day he might call for him to take him there to see if everything was to his taste. The emperor decided upon the following day, the 9th. The Grand Marshal and the Admiral accompanied him, and he mentioned certain details of layout, requested certain furniture which he needed, and personally thanked the Admiral for the speedy execution of all the alterations he had effected. The stories he had been told respecting their establishment there led him to believe that it was worse than it was, but each of his companions looked after himself in the best possible fashion. Masson, by flattering the Admiral, whom he scarcely left to himself, and at whose house in Jamestown he had, with his wife, dined as often as he had been invited. Gorgo, by provoking a quarrel with Masson, endless causes regarding the apartment which should be reserved for him. Bertrand, in order to be accommodated separately, instanced to this end the noise which his children would make, and the habits which the Countess had adopted. To have pleased everybody would have required a beautiful castle with huge annexes, and Longwood, as the emperor had seen it upon landing, was nothing more than a miserable shed with 5 rooms on the ground floor and a loft above. It had been immediately necessary to add to those 5 rooms sufficient accommodation for the 2 Montalots, the 2 Lascazes, O'Meara, the superintending officer, and the servants. There had been added, therefore, a square upon the original building, a wooden structure comprising 1 room for the antechamber or waiting room, and a second for a reception room. This latter opened out into an apartment of the old house, which, despite being very dark, since it was lighted only by a narrow window, was made the library. This later became the dining room, and the library was thereupon moved to a room which opened on the left of the dining room. The study opened on the right of the same apartment, and although it boasted 2 shuttered windows, it was extremely narrow. A fairly large table occupied the center of it, sandwiched between a bookcase and a little camp bed. The bedroom, of the same size and hung with a nankeen bearing a red border, came next, almost entirely filled with a camp bed, a sofa over which hung the portrait of the Empress Marie Louise holding his son in her arms, a chest of drawers between the 2 windows, a little table on which the emperor had to have breakfast, and a huge silver wash basin brought from the Elysee by Marchand. The chairs, armchairs, and sofa were painted green, with cane seats. In front of the drawing room door was a fireplace, the mantelpiece and shelves of which were of gray painted wood, and the hearth of which was furnished with a little coal grate decorated with a small chimney frame of little gilded columns containing a tiny mirror 18 inches by 15. On the shelf Marchand stood two indispensable silver candlesticks, a silver gilt cup and saucer, and a silver scent box on each side. The looking glass he placed a portrait of the King of Rome, and beneath the alarm clock of Frederic the Great, and the Emperor's watch. On the left of the fireplace on a little table stood the Emperor's dressing case open, and on the panel above these hung another portrait of the King of Rome. Behind the bedroom, and communicating with it by a little doorway, was a kind of narrow corridor, at one end of which the valet slept. On the other side, separated by a partition, was placed the huge wooden tub lined with zinc, which Admiral Cockburn had instructed the carpenter of his ship to make for a bath.